Let's now see how we can test the programming effects for the simple class so far. We haven't got any methods yet, but we can already do some simple manipulation. Let's see how we can do it. And rather than defining a JUnit test cases, which I will do later, but let me just show you how you can do console application, so you can see some something printed out to the console, which will be quite useful sometimes. But I would say when things get more complicated, you should rely on the JUnit test cases rather than console. But for the simple ones, that's okay. So what I will do is I'm going to right click on the console apps package over here, right? It's a different concern, but now because now we want to manipulate the model class we have developed so far. So I will go to new and class, and what should I call that? So it's really up to you, but let me just follow this convention. Whenever I'm doing console apps, it's more like an application, like an app, right? So I would say products, just the name we are trying to build the app from, product app. And in this case, we must choose the public static void main method, meaning that we are going to put some print statements and potentially also some scanner class objects to actually reading some input from the keyboard, which I'll show you maybe later, but at least we can see system out of print line. Just remember, you want to check this box over here. Okay, I'll say finish. So this is just another class. You can see we got two classes so far, and these two classes belong to different packages. One belongs to console apps, the other one belongs to model. Okay, and if you take a look at this newly created console application class product app, you can see this main method has been added automatically because we checked that box. In case you forgot to check the box, you can always type public static void main and also some string array for arguments. The arguments over here is for command line arguments. Maybe later towards the end of the semester, if you're interested, you can ask me, or just during my office hour, you can ask me how this works. This is kind of beyond the scope for this particular course. You'll learn about command line arguments more thoroughly in your later course for system programming. Let's now try to visualize the object creation very quickly, right? Remember, in the product class, we did not have any explicitly defined constructors, meaning that there will be an implicit default constructor that's available to us. How? Let's take a look. Let me now go double click on the product app to maximize it. Do you remember how to create a new objects, right? First of all, you gotta declare some object variable. So the type of the object variable will be the class name, products, and we can simply say p. Oh, by the way, since let me just maximize it here. You can see we are trying to refer to the product class inside this product app class, but they belong to different packages, so they are not automatically visible, right? So this is not automatically visible to, inside this class, unless you actually try to import it. So what we will do is, you can see when I type product over here, it tells me currently it cannot be resolved. It's not really visible. However, it's possible for you to actually import it. So what you will do is, you will simply, you can see the red line, red underline, you will do control space. Okay, control space is going to give you options. So which one do you want to import? In this case, you want to say that's the product from the model package, right? You can see that's a product class from model package that we want to use. So you will choose it over here, and this import statement is added automatically. Okay, so we say product, so that's a type of some variable, and we say p, and that should be assigned the address of some new objects, right? I will talk about these address and object creation more visually, maybe in the next video. I'll trace that on the paper together with you. So we're going to use a new keyword, and then we're going to use the constructor. But the problem is, we don't seem to have any explicit constructor over here in this section. But as I said, there will be an implicit one available to you. Let's now use it. And the implicit one will simply, remember, constructor have the same name of as the class name. So we're going to say products over here, and for the implicit constructor, it takes no arguments. So just like that, you can see there's no input you can pass for default constructor, right? No input, no arguments. That's it. You can see everything compiles, which is good. And then what can we do with it? We can try to print it out. So we're going to say system.out.println. So that's one way to go. Or in the Eclipse, there is a very useful shortcut you can use. You can simply say sysout and then control space, and then it will complete it for you. Okay, sysout and then control space. And what do we want to print out? Let's say we only want to print out P over here, and this will be a nice quiz question for you to see what you have learned. If you still remember what you learned from the first year. Are we going to, actually for this P here, well, what's going to be the console output? I'll give you two choices. Choice number one, console output is going to be the default values for all the attributes, right? Because we don't really assign any values like iPad Pro 12.9 to this particular model attributes. So everything should just have their default value. That's choice number one. Choice number two is going to print out the address of this particular objects, P. Okay, which one? Choice one or choice two? Make up your mind, and then let's now test it. The way to test a console application is, since we got a main method, so that means we got a single point of execution now for us to choose. So I can right click on this Java class with the main method. I can say run as Java application. Alternatively, you can simply choose that particular class, and then you can click on just play. That will typically do. But you can just verify by seeing there was a run product app.java, right? So either way. So let me just do it the more lengthy way, which is always safe. Run as Java application. Okay, so what we see is, you can see we see something that looks more like an address rather than saying the different values, the different default value for the attribute, right? So that's choice number two. Hopefully that's the one you made, right? I will explain more about address like this later, okay? So this one is telling us when we try to print out P, apparently it's not null. So there's really an object that has been created in the memory. And that one is of this particular type, model.products. Model is the package, and product is the class name. And then, so this is the unique address. In some ways, like a serial number for objects. Hopefully that makes sense to you for the analogy. All right, so that's about the output, but I would like to do a little bit more to show to you. And that's a very good point to actually somehow revisit the use of debugger. And again, I would like to emphasize it's really important for in this course for you to learn about debugger. So if you really haven't used any debugger either in IntelliJ or in Eclipse, I will highly recommend go to the Java tutorials from EECS2030, Windows 21, and you may at least want to go over part B, C, and D. B, C, D, E. For week number 2, at least go over them, so you will have some idea about what the different options are really meant for. Step over, step into, and step out. So that's really important, because throughout the tutorial series, or even for later in the course, I will always emphasize the use of debugger. Debugger is your friend for fixing, for revealing any defects in your software. Okay, I cannot emphasize this more. So now, how do we use it? Okay, so we'll simply set a breakpoint. So now we want to somehow pause over here, pause the execution right over here. Okay, so what I will do, once I set a breakpoint, I'm going to click on the debug button here. Right, you can see that's debug. And when I say debug, it's going to confirm. Well, currently we are not in the Java perspective, meaning that we are editing our Java code. Whenever you want to use the debugger for the convenience of the various different functions, you will be switched to the another perspective called the debug perspective. So I would say switch. If you don't want to be bothered by this prompt, you can always say remember my decision. But for me, I'm just gonna say switch, so I can always remind you we are now switching from Java perspective to the debug perspective. I'll say switch. Okay, so now we are now in the debug perspective. You can see now we got two perspectives. You can see my mouse is here. So this is where we were in the Java perspective. Now we've been switched to the debug perspective. Always remember, once the debugging process terminated, you want to switch back to the Java perspective, right? That's I'll show that to you once we are done. Okay, so now we got this. So now the executions pause at this particular point right before we execute this line, right before. Okay, and you can see under variables over here, you can see for P, we got a different attributes over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Not surprising, because if you click on the product class, that's exactly the 6 attributes that we have. Remember the sentence I said before when I declared those attributes. The set of attributes you declare for your class will determine the runtime structure of its individual objects. So P is just one of one example of the individual objects. Its structure is exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 attributes. If you find it very comfortable to read the object structure in the debugger, awesome. But I will also show you how to trace it on the paper from my iPad. I'll show that to you as well. Both are important. Let me go back to your product apps, and then you can see we got default value for double 0.0. We got default value for objects, which remember string. String is a reference type, which is an object. It's simply null. We got null for finish and null for model. We haven't set anything. They just default value. And we got default value false for boolean, default value 0 for storage, which is integer. Okay, let me refer you to some slides for you to study, to review. If I go back to the slides, which should be here, okay. So if you can go over slide 14 and 15, let me show to you. Okay, starting from here. So slide 14 and 15 will actually review about the 2 kinds of data types that we have in Java. One is called primitive, the other one is called reference. You can think about anything that's not primitive will be reference. That's the easiest way to define them. Okay. And then we also got the default values for each kind of types over here. Okay, like here, you can see 0, 0.0, false, and also null. That's exactly what we saw on the debugger here, right? And this is something I will mention a little bit more about the possibility of running into null pointer exception, especially for reference type. Let's say if we got a person Jim, if Jim has not been initialized to any object reference or object address, in that case, if you say Jim.getName, for example, you're basically doing null.getName. So that will give you a null pointer exception, which is very common for object-oriented programming, right? That's something I will also show to you later when we get there. Okay, so these are the 2 slides you need to review for this video. Let me just go back there. And then one more thing to show you, right? From the debugger, how can we see the address for this object? If I click on P here, you can see here, it's show you the address again. If you can just remember this number for me, model.products 55590. Remember that, okay? And now if I say step over here, that means I want to execute this line. Currently, I'm pausing right before this executing this line. But if I say step over, so that means I want to execute this line and go to the next one. If I say execute, and you can see this is exactly the address I wanted you to memorize, 555590, right? So it's only printing out the address of this particular object variable. There will be a way to override or redefine this behavior by declaring the so-called toString method, which I will show to you later for the further developments for the product class. Okay, hopefully so far you're okay. It's a very simple way for visualizing the effects of your program just using console application. We haven't shown to you how to read input from the keyboard. For this video, we don't need to, but I will show that to you in the next video. Okay, I want to do one more thing before I end the current video. Okay, and you can see now I already terminated the debugger by pressing the stop button here. And now don't forget you want to switch back to the Java perspective. So I'm going to click on the Java perspective over here. And then let me go back to the product class. I would say typically if you believe you might want to, if you ever are gonna find the implicit default constructor useful to you, which means you simply want to create an object where every attribute simply store their default values to start with, as we saw before. I would say don't leave it implicit, because if you want to use an implicit constructor, in that means you cannot define any additional constructors. As soon as you define the additional constructor, the default one will simply disappear. Okay, I'll try to show that to you, illustrate to you if I remember in the next video. But my advice would be, if you really find the default constructor useful, define one explicitly. Otherwise, no additional constructors. Otherwise, okay, as soon as any additional constructors are added, the implicit one becomes unavailable. Yeah, I definitely should fix the typo. The implicit one. Okay. So I would suggest define the default constructor explicitly. How do we define that? Very easy. Okay. So how do we define a constructor? Typically, constructor should be public. So that means any class can actually create the product objects. So we would say public, and then don't say void, because void does not apply to constructor. And also return type does not apply to constructor. You're going to use the same name as a class. So I'm going to say public product. And then there'll be no parameters, no input value for the default constructor. And then you simply do nothing. Meaning that all attributes will be stored their default values after an object is created. Let me also fix the typo here. So it should be I here. Okay. One more thing I want to show for the current video before I end it. I want to go back. You can see after we have added this default constructor explicitly, everything still compiles, right? You can see there's no, you can see under the problems panel over here. So these are simply some warnings which you can safely ignore, but we don't have any errors which are in red. If I go to product app, you can see this one here. So now rather than calling the implicit one as we did before, since we already added the default constructor explicitly, so this is now calling the default constructor that we have defined, which is exactly here, right? And as an exercise for you, launch the debugger and inspect the object state, meaning the values for the attributes for P after calling this default constructor, the explicit one that we define. Okay, and if I simply run the console application, you will see we simply just got a new product objects, and the address may be different from before because between executions we might simply just we might simply just allocate different parts of the memory for this new object over here. So the address may not be the same every time, but that's okay. As long as they're being consistent within an execution session, that we are fine. All right, so we'll make sure you actually do the exercise. If you're not so familiar with the debugger, it will be very beneficial. And in the next video, we'll actually try to define an overloaded version of this particular constructor, meaning that we're going to add a second version. We'll see.